this is one of the short talks that I did last August, so August 2019. So it's little clips from the last talk. It's actually like 43 slides, so it might take me a little bit. So I apologize if we linger on, but I'll try to just scroll through this. I just want to talk about some of the research on stress, the effects of stress on the brain, obviously chronic stress on the brain, what changes within the nervous system when stress occurs and it sticks around, and then also like what happens to the nerves and the different parts of the nerve, and how chronic stress really is just bad for our brains overall. Obviously, stress is something that we all have to experience in life. So another thing that I think we should talk about maybe in another talk is building resilience to stress. So there's lots of ways to do that, lots of practices that you can do, different techniques that you can use to help build resilience to stress. So that's kind of for another chat. So this is all kind of just research and some of the anatomy. But this is basically what happens. Your brain starts to shrink with prolonged chronic stress exposure. And what I would say is important areas of your brain start to shrink because other areas of your brain can actually kind of grow and get stronger, which is a little bit weird. But what is stress? Here's a simple definition of stress. So it's the body's reaction to any change that requires an adjustment or response, like the pandemic that we're all experiencing. The body reacts to these changes with physical, mental, and emotional responses. Stress is really a normal part of life, and you can experience stress from your environment, your body, and your thoughts. Even positive life changes, such as a promotion at work, a mortgage, so you're able to buy a house, or the birth of a child can produce stress. So there's good stress and there's bad stress. It's just really how you perceive it. So stress is a state of threatened homeostasis caused by intrinsic or extrinsic adverse forces or stressors, and it's counteracted by an intricate repertoire of physiologic and behavioral responses aiming to maintain or reestablish the optimal body equilibrium, eustasis. The adaptive stress response depends upon a highly interconnected neuroendocrine, cellular, and molecular infrastructure, the stress system. So the whole talk that I did, it talks about the history of stress, something called general adaptation theory, and it just talked a lot about some of the history of stress and then what we know about it to this day. So that's a little definition I wanted to throw in there because there's lots of different mechanisms and different networks and different systems involved within our body when we talk about stress. The stress response. So the first step in the stress response is the actual perception of a stressor. Some people may get stressed out more easily than others. So it really just depends on the person's perception of what's stressing them. When a situation is perceived as a threat, the brain recruits several neuronal circuits to maintain physiological integrity, even in the most adverse conditions. So remember, the body's always trying to balance itself out. It's trying to say, hey, this is stressful, but hey, this is how we can handle it and kind of bring things up to speed and up to balance. However, detection of different types of stressors requires engagement of different networks. Psychological and physical stressors engage different neuronal networks and cellular activity, leaving distinct footprints within the brain. Stimuli that produce actual disturbances of physiological status that overwhelm the organism, such as like hemorrhage or infection, so basically like a traumatic brain injury, those are considered physical stressors, right? And then obviously, on the other hand, psychological stressors are generally defined as stimuli that threaten the current state and are perceived in anticipatory conditions. So it could be like, hey, you got to go into work Monday morning and get a bunch of stuff done. Aversive environmental stimuli, some like this they say in here, predator related cues, like something bad's about to happen, or you can kind of foresee something occurring. And failure to satisfy internal drives. So you've got psychological, you've got physical, and then you've got all these other types of stressors too. But when you think about it, nothing is actually a stressor unless the brain and the body regard it as such. And I found this interesting because sometimes the way that our brains work is we default to survival mode. We'll default to panic mode. And it's important to remember to try to use that rational part of your brain to say, hey, is this actually as bad as it seems that it could be? Sometimes it really is, and it's important to recognize that. Sometimes it's not, though. And if we allow some of these stressors in life to really take over our brain, it can lead to chronic stress. And what you'll see is that that can really shut down some important areas of the brain. So I wanted to show you this, for instance. This was the new documentary, I think came out last year or the year before, with this young guy named Alex Honnold. He's a free solo climber, and I'm not sure if the Netflix, or I'm sorry, if the documentary is still on Netflix or like on Prime or Hulu or something. But my wife and I watched it, and it was the craziest thing to watch because I was sitting on the couch, and our neighbors told us about it. They said, "Hey, you really have to check out this documentary. This kid's amazing." I don't rock climb like as a sport or anything, so I didn't know much about it, and I didn't know people were actually doing this. But they do these wild solo climbs up crazy high cliff faces, and the whole documentary is about him uh, basically figuring out how to climb. I think it was called El Capitan, this monstrous mountain with no harnesses, no safety net or anything. So I'm watching this thing, and I'm sitting there on the couch, and like my body is like, I'm all tensed up. My palms are sweaty just watching him do all of his practice runs and everything. And I'm thinking to myself, how is this kid, if you watch it, the whole documentary, he's so chill, like he's crazy chill. And he talks about like, hey, I've done it so many times. I've ran through this climb particularly in my head so many times. I've physically done it with harnesses. So it built some resilience to his stress. And obviously, if you're going to do this solo and you freak out or stress out, one false step and you die. And he talks about that. He has friends and I guess you call them colleagues, I don't know, buddies that do these climbs too that have unfortunately passed away from horrible falls. Anyways, the reason I'm showing you this is because it kind of just goes to show you like stress really is what you perceive it to be. He's happy as a clam sitting up 3,000 feet in the air with nothing holding him except for his fingers and toes on the side of a wall. But one group actually wanted to study his brain. And so what they did was they put him in an fMRI machine and they scanned him. And while they were scanning him, they were just showing him, I think it was like different images or putting him in like different perceived situations of really bad stress or fear. And what they found was that the area of the brain that was responsible for kind of lighting up when those images or those scenarios were presented to him, they wouldn't light up on him, which meant that he had a little bit more resilience in his stress signaling pathways. So in the control subject here, where the crosshairs are, that's apparently where you get, sorry, I got a little fuzzy floating around. That's apparently where amygdalar heightened sensitivity would react when one of the subjects would see something scary or be in a scary scenario. For Alex, though, he was just chill. He's like, yeah, whatever, man. I see that. Like, doesn't bother me at all. And you can tell too, like throughout the documentary, his affect and mood is just a little bit. It's not. He's not very emotional in the way that he speaks or with his relationships. So I just found his personality to be hilarious. But it's amazing to watch that because I wasn't even climbing the mountain and I was almost having a heart attack watching him do it. But yeah, so he's one of the best free solo climbers in the world, and he ended up at the end of it. Oh, I won't spoil it. Never mind. I'm not gonna spoil it. Um, but anyways, crazy stuff. So stress is a brain event, and again, just as a reminder, I know that not to generalize anything, but if we can kind of think about stress in the way that we're perceiving it, it could be that something may not be as bad or as stressful as our brain is kind of building it up to be. But it is a brain event. And just something that's really important when we talk about stress is talking about the concept of neuroplasticity, which I know everybody knows about. But what happens with stress is that you can actually have alterations and changes in neuroplasticity. So basically, you basically decrease your chances of building good plasticity in your brain. So neuroplasticity can be defined as the process by which the brain produces more morphological changes in response to environmental stimuli, but they can be positive and negative, which we talked about last week. It occurs during our lifetime and of course occurs after injury, trauma, or stress. And stress actually has a negative impact on neuroplasticity, and it can actually build efficiency in pathways that we may not want, pathways that will actually make us more heightened in the stress response realm of things. So this is a paper from Nature, Mechanisms of Stress in the Brain. It's actually a pretty big paper, packed full of like tons of great information. But its main focus is on stress in the brain. So a key result of stress is what they talk about in this paper is structural remodeling of neural architecture, which I always find so interesting because when you learn about the brain, obviously there's structure, and then there's function. So you have these physical structures within the brain, these physical pathways, but then you also have these functional connections. And so what this paper was saying was that there's structural remodeling happening within the neural architecture. So that may be a sign of successful adaptation, whereas persistence of these changes when stress ends, it indicates a failed resilience. So I just thought it was interesting because it talks about how you see these literal, like physical structural changes within the brain due to prolonged stress exposure. And what that was also saying is, hey, this may be a sign of resilience, like you've built up a resilience to the stress response, or it could be a sign that things aren't working as well as they should. So the paper just goes on to talk about, acute versus chronic, and then basically the loss of resilience. It talked about the resilience of stress. So what happens if there's chronic stress exposure to the brain is you can get suppression of what's called synaptic transmission. You get suppression of what's called long-term potentiation, and this is how we build a lot of plasticity within the nervous system. You get suppression of learning, so learning for less important things, and then suppression of neurogenesis. So basically what happens is you lose the ability to build new healthy neurons or new healthy neuronal connections. And it mediates dendritic remodeling. So the dendrites are little branches that come out of neurons and they help communicate with other neurons. And those actually, what you'll see is they actually start to shrink in important areas of the brain. And then also there's an inflammatory component to this too. So there's neurochemicals that are involved, and you get impaired remodeling and lack of recovery from stress. So you get these neurochemical changes, you get these physical changes, you get these functional changes, all because of chronic stress exposure. So there's three systems that are associated with the stress response. You have your neurological system. So what we'll talk about today is mostly up here. The frontal cortex, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus all play different roles within the nervous system. All are important, but we want some to work a little bit more efficiently than others. The endocrine system, so that's where we talk more about the neurotransmitters and the hormones, so epinephrine, aldosterone, cortisol, norepinephrine. Anytime you hear stress, most people think about cortisol. Sometimes we forget that you do have these sympathetic responses as well that involve epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then you get immune responses as well. And with chronic stress exposure, what it shows is that you have decreased resilience to your immune tolerance. So basically, your immune system may not work as efficiently as it could be working. So people sometimes get sick more easily, or they're always sick and they can't figure out why. So stuff like that. So this is just an image, and I believe this paper is actually from, I think they studied the effects of stress in like octopus or something. It was the weirdest paper, but I just like the image. So environmental stressors, you have all these systems involved. So octopus get stressed out too. I don't know if they have the same stressors as us. I mean, they have 8 legs. So anyways, key brain areas involved with stress. So the human brain under stress, the big area we're going to talk about, which I've talked about before in our other talks and our other posts, is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the big, they call them the chief executive officer or whatever. They're the CEO of our nervous system. So the prefrontal cortex is involved with decision making, working memory, self-regulating behaviors, moods, and impulses. It helps shut down the stress response. That's the most important part about this. It has all these other really important functions for helping us be normal functioning humans, but it helps reduce or mitigate the stress response, an unwanted stress response, right? It helps allow for balanced stress response, but when it stops working as well as it should, it can't shut down a chronic stress exposure. The hippocampus, which everyone is very familiar with, I'm sure, is memory, right? So we're really talking about different types of memory involved with the hippocampus. And it also does play a role in helping to shut down stress. It also has it has a high affinity for cortisol. So cortisol will actually kind of make its way to the hippocampus. And short term, that's okay, but long term, you can see that it can make some negative changes in the hippocampus. And the amygdala. So that's responsible for aggression, fear. It's part of the emotional center of the brain, and it plays a very important role. But long term, it can actually turn on the stress response and keep it upregulated, which you'll see. So these two up here, especially this one, the prefrontal cortex, really important for helping to shut down, mitigate, hit the brakes on the stress response, as well as the hippocampus. And then the amygdala is supposed to, it's the stress response's buddy. It's like, hey, you got some stress here. Hey, you got some stress here. And again, short-term acute stress, that's okay. We need that. Chronic stress exposure, not so great. So again, from this paper, it just talks about some of those key areas. So I highlighted some stuff I wanted to show you here. I think it was just, so in the stress, or in the hippocampus, stress and glucocorticoids, so stuff like cortisol, they're first shown to cause what's called dendritic shrinkage and loss of dendritic spines in the hippocampus. So what that means is basically that chronic stress exposure is going to shut down the ability of producing positive plasticity in the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain responsible for memory. So what you may also see, let me see here, effects of acute chronic stress amygdala, there's a hippocampus. So there's obviously a difference between acute and chronic stress. I'm not going to read this in its entirety, but what I also wanted to show you is within the prefrontal cortex, chronic stress causes the medial prefrontal cortical neurons to develop debranching and shrinkage of dendrites that is associated with what's called cognitive rigidity. While on the other hand, another area in the frontal cortex called the orbital frontal cortex, those neurons expand. And that area is actually an area in the frontal cortex that's responsible for more aggressive behavior. So it's kind of a funky area in the frontal lobe. It's not really a regulating area. It's more of kind of a increase aggression and not normal behaviors when it's over firing or over functioning. So I found that really interesting. And when they talk about cognitive rigidity, I think I mentioned in some of our posts cognitive flexibility. So basically your ability to say like, okay, hey, that's someone's thoughts or behaviors, but like that's okay. Or, being able to kind of like flex and flow with different thoughts and opinions. With cognitive rigidity, it's basically like you're a one-stop shop. You got your eyes focused. It's very monoscopic. So you're just focused on one target all the way down. Anything else you hear or say who cares, doesn't matter. And that's okay for some things, but if you ever hung out with someone who's super duper hard-headed or very rigid cognitively, it's not that much of an exciting hangout day. but again, so you can see upregulation in bad areas, and then downregulation or dendritic shrinkage in important areas like the prefrontal cortex. So the frontal lobe, it's considered the emotional control center because it kind of hits the brakes, right? It's responsible for higher level thinking. So things like reasoning, planning, language, long-term memory, it plays a role in impulse control, problem solving, emotions, judgment, motor function, initiation, social, sexual behavior, appropriate social and sexual behavior. So it's an important area of the brain. We talked about this in the lobes of the brain little chat that we did. Okay, so a comprehensive overview on stress neurobiology. This just talks about different little pathways. It's actually, again, a pretty big read for a paper. Great, it's a great paper, but it talks about the neuroanatomy of stress pathways. So that's why I just wanted to share it with you. And most of the papers that I show you should be free access. Some of them I had to get access to. But if you like them, you can always Google them, look them up. Just type them into the Google and try to find them. So physical, what I have highlighted here, physical stressors mainly activate structures related to vital functions, control located in the brainstem and the hypothalamus. So it's not just the big brain too. You've got brainstem structures that play a role in the stress response, such as what's called the nucleus of the solitary tract. So nucleus tractus solitarius and the locus coeruleus. They have an important role in the physical stress pathways. But then it goes into talking about the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and then also the amygdala. But yeah, I just wanted to show you that's because it's not just all big brain. So the physiology of stress, this is what most people, like if you took anatomy and physiology, this is what you usually learn are these pathways. So you have a stressor, and then the hypothalamus releases a hormone, tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone to tell the adrenal glands to hit that fight or flight response, and the cortisol release, and then you get feedback. So different hormones at different points, and then the body gets the stress response. And then an appropriate working stress response, there should be some sort of what's called like a negative feedback loop, where it's like, okay, hey, we took care of this, and now shut things down. But what you'll see is that those pathways that are responsible for shutting down unwanted or unregulated signaling pathways, when they don't work, then that's when you get this chronic stress exposure, and you get stress resilience, lack of stress resilience. So in the normal stress response, like we showed earlier, this is talking more about inflammation in the immune response. But basically, what happens is you get cortisol release, and then at some point there's a blocking of inflammation. In the acute stages, you get like a little bit of inflammation, and then it's all shut down and regulated. But as you go down chronic stress exposure, there's other areas that play a key role, and this is showing sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And then you get alterations in cortisol levels, and then you get a lack of that negative feedback loop, and that's what can eventually lead to changes in brain function. And this is just talking about the physiology of stress pathways. And it's more so related to talking about inflammatory conditions, unregulated inflammatory conditions due to chronic stress responses in the system. But again, a good thing to remember too is that there's all different types of stressors. There's physical stressors, mental stressors, different types of nutritional stressors, and then you also get environmental stressors as well. So there's all different types of stressors. Stress, I think a lot of times you just think about stress as a physiological or psychological, a psychological issue, but there's so many other ways that the brain can get stressed out, and this stress signaling pathway can get screwed up. And what you really don't ever want to see is resistance within the system. When you start to see like cortisol resistance, or like, for example, in diabetes, you hear the term insulin resistance. That basically means that your body is not responding to the appropriate feedbacks that's happening. So what happens is you get just dysregulation in blood sugar because the cells aren't responding the way that they should be, because they're just kind of like overworked and underappreciated, I guess you would say. So again, this is just talking about different physiological pathways with stress, just to kind of remember that, hey, there's lots of other things involved besides like physical changes with the brain. But you get the same release of hormones that we talked about, but you get cortisol, and then you can get aldosterone released. And then this just talks about what happens over time when these are released. So you get impaired immune function, you get breakdown in antibodies, it can change muscle tone and muscle regulation. It can screw up your beta cells, which help with regulating blood sugar, depletes vitamins. It's crazy. Increases arterial blood pressure, which can cause lots of other issues as well. So lots of bad things can happen if chronic stress isn't regulated and overturned. And then just one last thing, I guess I had these in here, so I want to share just because, you know, we're always thinking about immune health and keeping ourselves a little bit more resilient, especially during these times. So with stress and chronic stress exposure, it does cause changes in immune function. We'll just say it that. That's, again, a generalization, but causes changes in immune function, but it can have detrimental effects on the immune system. And it can really make it so that the immune system isn't working as efficiently as it should. So with stress, you get reduced, with chronic stress exposure, you can get changes in natural killer cell activity. So reduced natural killer cell activity is not good. We want that to be normal and to be healthy. Changes in lymphocyte production and the way that they're working. You can have decreased helper suppressor ratios. So that's not good either. That's a loss of the balance of the immune system. Decreased antibodies. When we have antibodies, we can fight off different viruses and bacterias. So it's important to have a healthy dose of those. You can get reactivation of latent viruses. So when I was first in practice, we saw, this is the perfect example of this would be herpes, right? People who get really, really stressed out and they end up getting shingles. And it can happen after a traumatic, stressful event. All of a sudden, they start to develop these little pustules along a dermatome, and it's extremely painful. And it was actually ignited or initiated by a stressful response. It can also really shut down the brain. If you look at events like Bell's palsy, one of the first patients I ever saw was a Bell's palsy patient. And what happens in Bell's palsy is you lose regulation in facial tone of one half of your face. And it's a lot of times related to a stressful event. And it can be extremely scary because, of course, with stress, you can get increased blood pressure, which can mean a stroke. So you're automatically thinking, oh my gosh, did this person or did I have a stroke? And you go down that pathway, but it was just an activation or basically a screw up of your facial nerve, possibly due to a stressful event. Anyways, you get immune changes. And the big resounding picture here is that the less stress, this is the hope, the less stress, the less chronic stress exposure, the more that we can build a resilience to stress, we can have better immune function. And that's the goal with that. And obviously, there's so much more to that. And I don't mean to generalize, but chronic stress exposure is just really not good for our brains and bodies. So some key takeaways, the stress is a brain event, but involves the immune and endocrine system as well. There's so many systems involved. The first step in the stress response is the perception of a stressor. So it's always good to kind of stop and think, like, I'm trying to think of an example. I'll think of one when I keep talking. Anyways, it's always good to stop and think and say, hey, is this actually as bad as I think it is? Worst thing in the world is when you're about to go to bed and your brain's starting to like run through your day or run through what your next day is. And all of a sudden you start freaking out and stressing. I've had that happen before where like you're so tired, you go to bed and you're like, oh my God, brain, like shut off, like stop doing what you're doing, just let me go to bed. And you think about it and then you can feel your heart starts to race, you start to get a little bit hot, your breathing increases and you're like, why are you doing this to me? And it takes, so what I do if that ever happens is get up, walk, go get some water, kind of like take myself out of that situation and then go back in, or just start to work on my breathing. One of the best ways to help work on stress, but it's hard. You got to try to engage that front part of your brain and shut it down. Anyways, psychological and physical stressors engage different neuronal networks and cellular activity. We didn't talk too much about that today, but that's in the lecture. And then key brain structures are the frontal lobes, amygdala, and the hippocampus. And there's lots of other areas too, like we talked about different brainstem areas that play very important roles in regulation of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic tone, like the NTS and the locus coeruleus. So the effects of stress on the brain. Okay, we're finally getting to it. I don't know how many slides I have left, but I'm just going to keep blabbing and you guys show up or leave if you want to. So maternal stress and anxiety. This was when my wife was pregnant with our son, who's now 2.5. This was one of the most interesting things for me to learn because, for me as a spouse, there's a lot you can do, but you're thinking in your head, like, first of all, I've never done this before, had a baby. I don't know what to do, but I know that, stress can really beat you up. So I started to read research of like the effects of stress on mom during pregnancy and the effects that stress can have on the baby. And what I read kind of freaked me out because it's like, man, if there's chronic stress exposure for mom, this can really have a detrimental effect and impact on the developing fetus and when the baby's born. So, when you're going through pregnancy, I always just try to, whenever I talk to patients that are pregnant, I say, hey, just whatever you can do to not be stressed out. I know that sounds crazy and it's like whatever, because life is crazy stressful, but whatever you can do to try to keep chill throughout your pregnancy, it's so important. And for the guys or the spouses, whoever you may be, whoever the not pregnant person is, make sure that you try to create an environment that's not stressful for them, which is sometimes hard too. But basically, this just shows that the maternal stress anxiety, any types of mental illnesses, it can alter cortisol levels. That gets through the placenta and it can have an impact or effect on the baby. So this is a cool paper. Can I go back? The impact of developmental timing for stress and recovery. It's from like 2014, 15. But basically it talked about how stress can have lasting effects on the brain and on the child's behavior. So what they talked about was two critical periods. So the sensitive periods for brain development, and those periods are in gray. So from 0 to 3 years, that's considered, according to their research, a critical period. And then in adolescence, so at about 11 years old on, those are some critical periods. And what they found was that these sensitive periods of neural development, they may also render the developing brain most vulnerable to the effects of stress. So for 0 to 3 years old, one of the, what this reminds me of is after I read some of this stuff and our son was 1 or something and he was sleeping and we were trying to get him to like go to bed with some cuddling and whatever and then put him down, but then he'd freak out and stress out because mom and dad weren't in the room. My mind automatically goes, oh my gosh, he's having like separation anxiety, this isn't good for the brain, blah blah blah. But then you also have to try to balance it out and say, dude, you got to let him like figure this out on his own. It's important for him to build some resilience to this. So but you're always thinking like, oh, what impact is this going to have on him in the future? Like, they never loved me because they left me in there for an extra 5 minutes of crying or whatever. But there's some critical areas with brain development, and stress can have a negative impact on those little time windows there. So that's something important to remember. And so it's not just with the infants and with the toddlers, it also goes into adolescence too. And there's lots of changes in hormones happening here, which I haven't personally experienced with my son yet, but I'm sure I will. And my parents, I'm sure, experience with me. But it's important to remember that stress can impact the developing brain. Those are just some windows that they talked about that seem to be pretty critical. Um, Taking it back a little step further, so looking at maternal stress before baby's born, mom's nutrition, any type of like environmental or exposure, so infection, for pregnant moms during COVID, that's been kind of not a super duper hot topic, but people have been talking about what are the effects of, COVID, basically like the situation that we're in, but also if you do get exposed to the virus on the mom, the developing baby, the fetus. So also prenatal drug exposure. That's why some drugs, you can not absolutely take at all during pregnancy, stuff like that. But what they found was that you can get alterations in the brain. So size and shape, so that's structural. So you can see structural changes, cortical thickness, which basically means that they have like lack of muscle tone in the brain, alterations in functional connectivity, and then changes in white matter fiber tracts, which help with communication, creating plasticity, stuff like that. And what this paper talked about was long term, it could cause issues related to neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism, ADHD, behavioral disorders such as schizophrenia and affective disorder, and also neurodegenerative disorders like dementia. So it's just pretty wild stuff. Basically, chronic stress exposure is not great for the brain. Does prenatal stress alter the developing connectome? So this paper talked about, and it says right here, the human neurodevelopment requires the organization of neural elements into complex structural and functional networks called the connectome. So these are just connecting pathways for people that haven't heard that term before. But in short, yes, it can alter the developing connectome. I won't read all this to you, but there's increasing recognition that fetal stress exposure has a particularly pronounced impact during early periods of corticogenesis, commonly known as the critical periods, which you talked about a little bit about before. Critical periods are important because they can help increase plasticity, but they're also very vulnerable during those times too. So it's one of those things where it's like, hey, you can do some really great things during this time period, but if there's negative things happening, it could also screw up the brain a little bit. The impacts, and this is kind of going back to that same paper. So approximately 10% of youth have anxiety and stress related disorders. I read a paper actually talking about how we're having to socially isolate, and the impact that that's had on basically there's a rise in different types of anxiety disorders. So people calling in with an increase in their anxiety levels, obviously an increase in stress, domestic violence. My wife works in the hospital, and she's actually seen an increase in domestic violence cases due to stress and the social isolation, but then also people doing, self-harm as well, which is sad because it makes it very difficult. Stress can just kind of be very overwhelming at times. So, but understanding stress and understanding how we can try to build resilience and also shut down an unwanted stress response can make a really, really positive change and impact on our lives. So again, this is just kind of to reinforce what we've been talking about. We're going to go into basically how when we start to see changes in the brain, you can see acceleration or increased activity in some of those unwanted areas like the amygdala, and you can see decreased activity in the areas that we need to be working well, which is like the frontal lobe. So the enhanced amygdala activity and decreased prefrontal activity in children with a history of maternal deprivation may suggest that they're less able to suppress irrelevant emotional information, leading to dysregulation of emotions. So by preschool, these children have a rate of mental health disorders that's more than twice that in children who do not experience institutional rearing, which is what they're talking about there. But basically, having that bond, being socially stable, and not having like social instability or a lack of relationship with mom or dad. This talked about maternal separation. So there's a term called inflammaging or inflammaging, but adding fuel to the fire and the impacts of stress on the aging brain. So with this, obviously it's not going to be good, right? As we age, we do start to lose some of our resilience in those pathways. So what this paper basically talked about was chronic stress exposure can obviously cause changes in the brain, but then you also get that what's called inflammaging. So you have this like it's almost like an underlying slow but impactful inflammatory response that slowly kind of like over time starts to creep up. It kind of like flies under the radar for a little bit, but it ends up causing some issues with long-term exposure, such as breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, which we know is a major issue in a lot of our neurodegenerative disorders. It causes peripheral immune cell infiltration. So basically, critters can get into the barriers through the barrier system, which we talked about before, that shouldn't be there, and they can cause protein misfolding, protein aggregation, which will slow down neuronal communication, which can basically shut down the efficiency and speed of the brain. And then you can also get chronic glial cell activation, which over time isn't a great thing. And then one of my favorite things to always talk about is the gut-brain axis and how what we do, what we put into our system affects our brain and vice versa. But you get altered gut microbiome and diversity in the microbiome has been shown to be really, really impactful on brain health. So loss of that microbiome diversity can actually cause issues as well. And of course, you get neuronal dysfunction and impaired feedback with these stress response pathways. So it can all lead to cognitive impairment. It can lead to emotional disorders like anxiety and depression, and then reduce sociability. So like just kind of sitting in your room, reading the newspaper, not wanting to talk to anybody, cranky old person. So sometimes it's not the cranky old person's fault, right? Sometimes it could be a metabolic dysregulation, a chronic stress exposure, stuff like that. So same paper. The concluding remarks of this paper was basically, if you're old, don't try to change yourself, change your environment. And I like that because I think our environment has a major impact on our brain health and kind of taking our brain, our physical body out of a stressful environment or a stressful situation can have very positive effects on the way that we build resilience to the stressor and the way that we respond to the stressor. So the way I took that after reading this paper was basically, hey, you can start learning to surf at any age, right? So go to the beach with your friends at 70 and learn how to surf. That's how old those people are. But you got to change your environment. You got to mix it up. One of the best things, I know I talked about how meeting your nervous system where it's at, but if there's something that's a stressful response or a stressful situation, just walk away. that's one of the best things you can do for your brain and your body, is to just walk away from the situation, give yourself 5 minutes to kind of gather your thoughts, maybe go for a light walk, work on some deep breathing exercises, and then kind of revisit the situation once your rational brain, that frontal lobe, has been allowed to kind of kick in, because it starts to lose efficiency with that chronic stress. So some key takeaways: the effects of stress they can begin prenatally, and they can have lasting effects on a newborn brain. There are sensitive periods during neurodevelopment that render the brain more vulnerable to stress. And what that one paper showed, and that's just one paper, 0 to 3, and then 11 up to your like 20s. But honestly, at any time, stress can have a negative, chronic stress can have a negative impact on the brain. The early years of life are the most important for setting our brains up for success. I'm just always so amazed. I have a 2.5-year-old at how much information they can take in and remember and learn. And then I also know that, stress can really shut that down. So we try to make our household as chill as possible, but also don't act like the fun aunt and uncle all the time. And then aging reduces brain resilience. So environment can be key. If we can put our brain and our bodies in a healthy environment, our brain can be set up for more success. That's like the best prescription, right? Your patient comes in and they're like, oh man, I'm just like, I have all this stuff going on. I wish you could just say like, hey, go to the beach for a week and just come back. Like, go to a nice quiet beach for a week and then come back. Let's retest all of this and see how you're doing. Because I have this strange feeling that lots of things would get a lot better unless you went there and just like stayed connected and stressed out. But if you just went there and chilled out for a week, I say the beach. If climbing a mountain without safety straps is your thing, you could do that too. For me, it would be the beach, but I wish you could just say, hey, go to the beach, take a week off, just shut down, reboot. I think that would be an amazing thing. I think we should implement that in our systems with the workplace. Everyone should at least have one required week off the beach. Okay. So so just to kind of show you again, this is kind of repetition is the language of the brain. So we're just talking about, what we're mostly talking about is prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So with the prefrontal cortex, think of it as like the ability of the brain to say, hey, everything's cool, everything's fine, just stay calm, no worries. But then the amygdala is like, hey, this is bad, this is dangerous, get out of here. So if it actually is, that's when we're like, thank you, amygdala, you're awesome, thanks for working well. But if it's not, if you're just, sometimes I'll work with car accident patients, and after a bad injury, they'll get back in a car and they're totally fine, but their brain's like, hey, why are you putting me in this situation? Their amygdala kind of ramps up and it says, get me out of here, get me out of here, get me out of here. So you have to tell them, hey, just remember, like, you got to slowly try to shut that down. So it can be good, it can be bad. So I've mentioned this author before, 2 papers that I really like. They're both here. But she talks about how the prefrontal cortex, the most evolved brain region, subserves our highest order cognitive abilities. It's also the brain region that is most sensitive to the detrimental effects of stress exposure. Some people may argue that the hippocampus and the memory centers are, but she talks about how the frontal lobe is most sensitive to the detrimental effects of chronic stress exposure, which she talks about later. So more prolonged stress exposure causes architectural changes in prefrontal dendrites. When I read this, I'm like, oh man, that's crazy, because you have this psychological, if this is a psychological event, right, causing a structural change in the brain, that's wild. And then, she goes to show that the 2 different images of basically how you have what's called top-down regulation. So the prefrontal cortex in a non-stressed condition, it kind of regulates or puts the brakes on the lower areas of the brain, like the amygdala. However, the amygdala, during a stressful event, it can control, and it can actually kind of take over what the prefrontal cortex is trying to do. So it's almost like if you think of the prefrontal cortex as like a governor. So if you're like a governor, I think of like a golf cart. You're driving a golf cart, but you can only go so fast, unfortunately, because people want to go crazy on those things. But there's something basically not allowing you to go that fast. So that's what the prefrontal cortex is doing. It's kind of like saying, hit the brakes, everything's cool. when the stressful event happens, the amygdala, it kind of overtakes, and then the prefrontal cortex can't really do its job like it normally does. So another paper, same author, basic research has found that high levels of catecholamine release during stress rapidly impairs the top-down cognitive functions of the prefrontal cortex, while strengthening the emotional and habitual responses of the amygdala. So that's kind of where you see that change in the seesaw pattern. So high levels of norepinephrine release during stress engage. She was studying these receptors in this research paper, which rapidly reduce the firing of the prefrontal cortex neurons, but strengthen amygdala function. So again, just shut down prefrontal cortex, increase the amygdala. And these are the little images here. I won't go into detail and read about it. She was studying different types of receptors, which is why she mentions these. So you get a weakening of those receptors in the prefrontal cortex, and you get a strengthening of those receptors in the amygdala when chronic stress exposure takes over. Now, the bad part about this is that this is when plasticity can be negative, right? So you can have these amygdalar pathways and these receptors actually strengthening, and over time they can become stronger than what's on the left side here. So basically the amygdala can kind of react a little bit more quicker, more efficiently, and the prefrontal cortex loses that efficiency and it can't shut down that unwanted response. So, and those were those two papers. Those both are free access. I mentioned those in other talks, so check those out. They're just, if you're kind of a nerd and you want to read more about stress, the second paper, she talks a lot about PTSD. It's really, really cool stuff. Okay, social influences on neuroplasticity. Stress and interventions to promote well-being. Another good paper, but what I liked about this, social influences are among the influences on brain structure and function that are most powerful in inducing plastic change. Here we review important evidence in animal models and humans. Although the precise mechanisms of plasticity are still not fully understood, moderate to severe stress appears to increase the growth of several sectors of the amygdala, whereas the effects on the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex tends to be opposite. So this is kind of just validating what I had found earlier. And so in the talk, I talked about different types of things we could do to try to mitigate the stress response and build resilience to stress. So this paper does go into talking about physical exercise, kind of meeting your nervous system where it's at, doing cognitive types of therapy, different types of practices like breathing exercises can help shut down the unwanted stress response. So if you're interested, read more about that. I can always do a talk on that too, just to try to show some of the research. But here's a picture of what they were talking about. So you've got your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus. Control, let's just imagine this is really big, juicy, healthy neurons. And then chronic stress exposure in this area of the brain, you see a shrinkage, right? You see less branches, less activity happening. And it's kind of hard to see in this image, but basically in the amygdala and in the orbitofrontal cortex, you see in the control, it's not as juicy and healthy as the prefrontal cortex, but in chronic stress exposure, it seems to be doing some outgrowth. So it's getting bigger. So again, with chronic stress, I always say like stress can shrink your brain. It can shrink those important areas of your brain, but it can also build strength in they're important areas, but not the ones that we want to build strength in areas of the brain, like the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex. Fear conditioning. So I think this is just another picture. Oh no, this is a good paper on PTSD for people interested. And I'm not sure if I've shared this image before, but basically it talks about synaptic plasticity in the amygdala. Basically what happens in the brain with PTSD. So with here in the prefrontal cortex, remember it's responsible for regulating emotion, regulating mood and behaviors. And in PTSD, you basically see decreased gray and white matter density, so structural physical changes in the brain, and decreased responsiveness to trauma and emotional stimuli. So it's not working as well as it should. In the amygdala, however, conditioned fear and associative learning, in PTSD, you see an increased responsiveness to traumatic and emotional events. And then with the hippocampus, this one talks about how you have increased responsiveness to traumatic and emotional stimuli, but it's also it's responsible for conditioned fear, memory. It doesn't go into talk about that as much as well. But with the parahippocampal gyrus, it does talk about the importance for memory. And yeah, anyways, thought it was a cool paper. Just wanted to share it with you guys. And we have a lot of people that do suffer from PTSD. So, what I can say to that is it's something that is difficult to try to work through and to deal with, but you can do things to try to shut down these unwanted responses and to build plasticity in those pathways of the brain. So some key takeaways, the frontal lobes are important for top-down regulation and control, which was basically kind of the big thing I really wanted to touch on. Chronic stress can really decrease frontal lobe function. The amygdala can increase with chronic stress, which can lead to negative plastic changes within the brain. Not all stress causes shrinkage. Some areas grow, like we talked about earlier. But just to finish it off, I know we're all kind of still, well, some of us mostly are still socially isolated, but it's going to be great when we can all get back together and try to stay connected. I have some friends that have been wanting to do Zoom calls, and I just don't feel like getting on Zoom calls. So they're probably watching this. If they ever see it, they're yelling at me. But trying to stay connected with family and friends as much as you can, virtually or 6 feet apart, it's really important. One chimp study showed that hanging out with friends makes life way less stressful. My mom's from New York, and she always says, "Oh, it's like a shot of medicine." It's always like a shot of medicine when she gets together with her best friends or even with family. So try to stay connected as much as we can. And I really appreciate your time. I know it's probably longer than I wanted to do for a webinar, but I got to get back to work. And I hope everyone has a great day and you're staying safe. And if you'd like for me to do another talk on building stress resilience, I can always do one of those as well. So thanks so much.